Imagine standing on the edge of the known world, where the horizon isn't just curved, it's actively trying to kill you. This is the year 1500, a forgotten, frozen epoch where the mapmakers simply gave up, leaving vast, uncharted blue where the Scottish Isles should be. Can you believe that this desolate archipelago, battered by winds that could rip the stone from the mountainsides, was the epicenter of the most savage, uncompromising human drama in European history? We are not talking about quaint villages and rolling hills. We are talking about sheer, black basalt cliffs plunging hundreds of feet into a churning, icy Atlantic that breathes only in gales and tidal surges. For 8 months of the year, the islands were locked in a siege, a never-ending war waged by the sea itself, forcing life into the dim, smoke-filled interiors of the ancient keeps. The Atlantic wind, a character in itself, was not just a breeze. It was a roaring, monstrous beast that screamed through the narrow clefts of the mountains, a constant, deafening reminder that civilization was an illusion, and survival was the only law. To step outside was to challenge a force of nature that had no pity and no memory. But inside those massive, unforgiving stone walls, that is where the fire-lit intensity of the saga truly begins. The interiors were worlds away from the frozen chaos outside, illuminated by the flickering, defiant glow of peat fires and iron lamps, casting huge, dancing shadows across tapestry-draped stone. This was the realm of the Celtic lords, the mighty clan chiefs, men whose names, MacDonald, MacLeod, MacLean, were synonymous with terror and absolute power across the entire Gaelic world. Their lineage stretched back to Viking invaders and ancient Irish kings, and they ruled by the sword, by the absolute ironclad loyalty of their kin, and by the sheer, terrifying force of their reputation. Every decision made in those smoky halls was a matter of life or death, not just for a man, but for hundreds of families scattered across the exposed, unforgiving land. The air inside reeked of brine, damp wool, and the metallic tang of ambition and freshly honed steel. They had carved out an empire, the fragmented, fiercely independent lordship of the Isles, a kingdom separate from the Scottish crown, a defiant middle finger aimed squarely at the distant authority of Edinburgh. This isolation was their strength, allowing them to dictate their own terms of justice, war, and trade. They were pirates, poets, and politicians wrapped into one fearsome package. Their longships, the famed Berlins, cut through the heavy seas, delivering terror and collecting tribute from the mainland coastlines they raided with brutal efficiency. They thought they were untouchable. They believed the sea protected them. But here is the catastrophic secret they all kept buried beneath the peat and the pride. Their independence was a candle flickering in a hurricane. The year 1500 marked a terrifying tipping point, a catastrophic moment no one saw coming, when the young, ambitious King James IV finally decided he wanted what they had: absolute, unquestioned obedience or annihilation. The mainland's strategy was chillingly simple. If you cannot conquer the islands with ships, conquer them with intrigue. And so the whispers began. Whispers of betrayal, of planted spies, of gold being slipped into the hands of ambitious kinsmen who suddenly felt their chief was becoming too old or too weak. Imagine the tension in the great hall on a night like this. Outside, the wind howls like 1,000 banshees, attempting to tear the roof off the very foundations of Dunvegan Castle. Inside, the MacLeod chief sits by the fire, his face grim, listening to the crackle of the flames, knowing that every sound could be the herald of a messenger bearing news of war, or worse, a viper's kiss from a cousin. The firelight, which was meant to be a comfort, became a dangerous mirror, reflecting the paranoia and the impossible choices these men faced. Should they unite against the looming threat of James IV, or should they seize the opportunity to betray their rivals and secure temporary royal favor, gambling everything on a peace treaty written in blood and ink? The clans were trapped. They were simultaneously fighting the most violent weather system in Europe and the most cunning political mind in Scotland. Their world was shrinking, and the ancient rules of honor were rapidly dissolving into a desperate scramble for survival. Every feast, every solemn oath, every shared dram of whiskey under that firelight suddenly carried the weight of the Last Supper. They knew, deep in their bones, that the age of the mighty island lords was drawing to a close, but they were determined to take as many of their enemies with them as possible. This is the story of a civilization defined by extreme contrasts, the brutal, frozen exterior versus the intense, passionate, fire-lit interior. It is a story about the ultimate struggle for identity when your very geography is working against you. A saga of defiance that echoes across 5 centuries. Get ready, because what happened next, when the Atlantic winds and the mainland's ambition finally converged on these isolated strongholds, was a catastrophe of betrayal and blood unmatched in their history. The greatest chiefs of the Western world were about to make their final, terrifying stand, and the price of failure was the eradication of their names from history itself. This is not merely history. This is the legend of the Isles, the time when fire and steel decided who deserved to survive the Atlantic fury. And the first casualty, as always, was trust. You won't believe the depths of the treachery that began to unfold as the storm raged outside. The trust was already gone, replaced by the chilling, corrosive whisper of self-preservation. Chief Alistair, his lineage stretching back to the ancient sea kings, looked out over the crushing gray violence of the Minch. He knew the storm wasn't just physical. It was financial, political, and catastrophically personal. The crown, distant yet deadly, had offered a terrible, impossible choice to the smaller, struggling clans. Submit the clan's ancient rights entirely, handing over every piece of hereditary power, or face total, ruthless annihilation by combined mainland forces commanded by the relentless Earl of Argyll. Alistair, watching his dwindling grain stores and knowing his men were exhausted from continuous vigilance, considered the unthinkable, a terrible, fatal pact with the very enemy he most despised, the Argyle Campbells. This pact demanded a betrayal that would sacrifice his powerful neighbor, Clan MacLean of Duart, to buy his own clan a single, precious winter of peace. This was not strategy. This was the dark, monstrous algebra of survival, where every equation required a human sacrifice to balance the scale of doom. The Atlantic wind howled like 1,000 tormented souls, seeming to mock the chief's agonizing dilemma. The islands were starving, not quickly, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. The cattle raids of the late summer had been catastrophic, depleting the essential winter stores faster than any elder had anticipated. When the salt spray froze to the stone walls of the keep, turning the ancient rock into a sheet of deadly ice, and the precious peats burned terrifyingly low, the true, brutal price of isolation became horrifically clear. To lack grain was to face a death colder and more drawn out than any battle wound. Every single ship that failed to reach the Sound, every fishing boat dashed against the relentless, unforgiving basalt cliffs, was not merely a loss of property. It was a hammer blow against the clan's fundamental right to exist. They didn't just fight for territory. They fought for the very right to draw breath in the face of an unforgiving, cold-blooded ocean and a cynical, manipulative crown. The chiefs were not simply landholders living in rustic splendor. They were desperate warlords, skilled ship captains, and ruthless economists trying to balance a ledger written almost exclusively in the currency of blood and frozen seawater, constantly recalculating their odds of making it to spring. The treacherous message that began the downfall was delivered not by boat, for the sea was too violent for any sane sailor, but by a runner who had traversed the lethal, snow-choked mountain passes of Skye and Rosse, clinging to existence with raw, bleeding determination. This man, wrapped in thick oilskins, stiff with frozen sleet, carried a sealed, damp parchment bearing the dreaded sigil of Inverary, the seat of the hated, ambitious Campbells. The chilling, meticulously worded ink promised not only gold and desperately needed grain, but, most critically, guaranteed immunity from the Crown's next devastating punitive expedition, the one that was rumored to be sailing north within weeks, loaded with heavy artillery. The price for this immense, life-saving guarantee was chillingly specific. Alastair had to provide false, crucial information regarding the exact disposition of the MacLean fleet anchored near Dart Castle. This single act of deceit, a calculated lie about the position of ships, would deliberately draw the mainland royal fleet south into a false channel, leaving the MacLean's powerful main stronghold vulnerable to a devastating, unexpected pincer attack from the north they could never possibly anticipate. This would be a deadly, surgical strike, executed not by the Crown, but by their own supposedly neutral, sworn neighbor. Alastair stared into the flickering, hungry firelight, the roaring heat of the peat doing nothing whatsoever to melt the block of ice forming rapidly in his gut. His wife pleaded with him, weeping softly as she grasped his arm. His most trusted advisors were hopelessly split between the ancient, sacred necessity of honor and the absolute, immediate need for survival. But honor, Alastair knew with a crushing certainty, was a luxury only the already dead could afford in this era of mainland consolidation and ruthless politics. The great, terrible paradox of the Isles was that loyalty was everything, the very soul of the clans, until the overwhelming demand of survival dictated that it must be absolutely nothing. To save his own 100 souls, he was condemning 200 others to certain slaughter, trading one clan's future for another. The very air in the stone hall crackled with the silent, monstrous weight of that unforgivable decision. His hand trembled, not from cold, but from moral terror, as he reached for the quill. The feather scratched horribly, grating against the thick, cold vellum, sealing the fate of the MacLeans with 3 simple, damning words written in his own hand. The South Sound is clear. When the deed was done, the ruthless logistics of immediate war immediately kicked into terrifying high gear. Alastair had to ensure his own defenses were now completely impenetrable, not just against the Campbells, who he fully expected to turn on him the moment the MacLeans fell, but against the inevitable, brutal retribution from any MacLean survivors who would surely seek vengeance forever. He called upon his most formidable, terrifying assets, the Gallowglass mercenaries. These were not local men who might balk at the betrayal. They were terrifying, towering, professional warriors imported directly from the far reaches of Ireland, paid solely in cold silver and the blood-soaked promise of plunder. Their legendary great axes were instruments of pure destruction. Their loyalty, being purely financial, was utterly dependable. These giants, clad in their distinctive, heavy padded coats and wielding massive, deadly two-handed claymores, formed the unbreakable backbone of the clan's immediate defense. They were the ultimate insurance policy, a clear, stark signal that this betrayal was backed not by desperate island skirmishers, but by cold, methodical, professional killing power drawn from beyond the sea. Their very presence instantly changed the bloody calculus of the entire archipelago. They brought a mainland ferocity and an unyielding professional brutality to what had been merely an island feud, transforming a local, manageable dispute into a looming bloodbath of epic, unforgivable scale. The storm broke 2 days later, not literally, but politically. The wind suddenly shifted. The tumultuous seas calmed just enough, temporarily, for 3 small, incredibly fast boats bearing the dreaded Campbell banner to slip silently through the Sound, carrying the crucial, fatal coordinates provided by Alastair. The MacLeans, entirely unaware of the dagger poised directly at their backs, were busy preparing their own deep winter defenses, trusting their northern flank implicitly to their ally, Alastair. They believed the approaching ships were friendly. They foolishly believed in the ancient, sacred bonds forged by centuries of shared hardships, feuds, and intermarriage. But in the c. 1500 Scottish Isles, such bonds were merely paper-thin against the razor-sharp steel edge of ambition and fear. The true soul-shattering horror was that the betrayal was executed not with a rallying shout of declared war, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a perfectly placed lie delivered across the freezing sea. And as the mainland ships sailed into the narrow, inescapable pass, the MacLeans were about to learn, in the most catastrophic way possible, that their deadliest enemy had been sleeping under their own roof, sheltered by their own trust. This wasn't just war. This was the crushing, agonizing end of a great legacy, orchestrated by a single, desperate man trying to buy one more winter of survival. The sea was about to turn violently, irrevocably red, and the whole world would eventually hear the unimaginable screams. The Crown, distant and perpetually paranoid in its stone castle, saw the Isles not as a cradle of culture and ancient sovereignty, but as a hotbed of untamed, rebellious savagery that needed to be ruthlessly suppressed and managed through loyal surrogates. When King James IV finally dismantled the semi-independent power of the MacDonalds, the mighty lords of the Isles, he didn't bring peace. He simply opened the floodgates for chaos, creating a colossal, bloody power vacuum that every ambitious clan rushed to fill with rapacious energy. The Campbells, the true masters of political maneuvering and strategic cruelty, had positioned themselves perfectly, marrying into royal favor and acting as the Crown's brutal, efficient enforcers in the West. They didn't just want the MacLeod's land. They wanted to erase the very memory of his lineage from the unforgiving geography of the Hebrides, claiming divine right to the MacLeod's ancient fishing grounds and ancestral burial sites. Their primary agent in this particular murderous hunt was Alastair the Serpent Campbell, a man whose smile promised warmth, but whose shadow dripped with the cold, calculated malice of 1,000 executed enemies. Alastair was not interested in a messy battle. He was interested in a clean, comprehensive sweep, and he had tracked Murdo's storm dancer relentlessly through 3 days of biblical rain and blinding sea fog, knowing exactly where the desperate chieftain would seek shelter. The sea itself was preparing the battlefield, churning into a frothing, mountainous fury that made the largest ships look like bath toys tossed by an angry child. In this forgotten corner of the world, where the ocean floor dropped thousands of feet just a mile offshore, the waves didn't just crash, they exploded, sounding like simultaneous cannon fire against the sheer cliffs of Skye and Islay. Imagine the pure, cold terror of the 16th century sailor. The deafening creak of the oak hull sounding like a death rattle, the rigging screaming in the high wind like tortured ghosts, and the absolute knowledge that one misplaced rogue wave meant instant, freezing oblivion, far from any chance of rescue or even dignified retrieval. Survival here was a constant, exhausting, moment-to-moment negotiation with a viciously merciless deity known only as the Atlantic. Murdo had navigated these treacherous waters his entire life, but even his hardened crew, men whose blood ran thick with centuries of seafaring lineage, were starting to pray to forgotten pre-Christian saints, begging for mercy. They were sailing straight into the eye of a legendary tempest the locals called the Witch's Breath, a storm born in the chill heart of the Arctic and accelerated by the Gulf Stream until it became a sentient, physical, destructive force capable of swallowing entire fleets without leaving a single trace of wreckage. The MacLeod's position was strategically terrible. They were sailing a narrow, deep channel, trying to pass the notorious Skerryvore Lighthouse rock cluster before dawn, hoping the speed of the storm would actually mask their flight rather than hasten their demise. But the darkness was suddenly ruptured by movement, a sight that turned the blood in Murdo's veins to ice. A piercing cry from the lookout sliced through the roar of the wind, sharper than any battle dirk. "Sail! 3 ships, bearing down fast, chieftain! They have the wind!" It was Alastair the Serpent, not alone, but backed by 3 massive burlens, traditional Highland war galleys, their square sails black against the gray, churning sky, propelled by the relentless, inhuman strokes of 200 oarsmen pounding the water. These were not simple coastal vessels. These were state-of-the-art warships, built for maximum speed and engineered specifically for collision. Their bows reinforced with thick iron plating designed to smash through lesser wooden hulls and sink them instantly. Alastair had them cornered, trapped perfectly between the raging main Atlantic swell and the treacherous, razor-sharp reefs known only to the MacLeod clan, turning the deep channel into a lethal funnel. Murdo MacLeod gripped the tiller, his knuckles white against the splintered, salt-worn wood, the terrible realization flooding his mind that his grand plan had been a magnificent, self-defeating failure, a beautiful piece of futile defiance that had only led his clan directly into the gaping, waiting maw of their executioner. His men, clustered nervously below deck, were armed with what little they had managed to salvage: rusty, inherited axes, long swords hammered out by village smiths, and a few precious, unreliable hand cannons imported illegally and at great cost from the merchant ports of Flanders. Against the disciplined professional ranks of Alastair's hired mercenaries and Campbell fighting men, the MacLeods were staging a peasant's desperate, last-ditch rebellion against an empire. Yet in the heart of the mounting storm, every man knew they would fight, not for the impossible dream of victory, but for the glorious, eternal right to die screaming their clan's name into the face of the unforgiving wind. The stolen cattle, bellowing madly in the dark, damp hold, smelled the blood that was about to soak the deck and run crimson into the sea, and their terrified cries joined the relentless, deafening symphony of human despair and meteorological malice. This was not just a battle for survival. It was the final, desperate, doomed act of a dying sovereignty, played out on a stage of black rock and crashing waves, utterly unseen and absolutely unforgiven by the wider world beyond the turbulent horizon. The king's agents, smooth, soft-handed men from the lowlands, smelling of cinnamon and condescension, believed that the destruction of the lordship of the Isles had solved the problem of the West. They were tragically, spectacularly wrong. The islands were not pacified. They were simply fragmented, turning the grand regional war into 1,000 venomous, localized feuds, each more barbaric and secretive than the last. The ultimate prize remained the same: control over the sea lanes, the vast herds of black cattle, and the unquestioning, deadly loyalty of men who knew how to kill silently in the dark, asking permission neither from God nor king.
This was the era of the Birlinn, the true, terrifying symbol of Hebridean sovereignty. Forget the lumbering warships of the mainland navies. The Birlinn was a sleek 30-foot war galley, driven by oars and manned by warriors whose hands were scarred by both fishing ropes and sword hilts.
These were not transport vessels. They were instruments of surgical annihilation. They allowed a chief of the McLeans or the MacDonalds to strike 30 miles away in the dead of night and be back anchored in their sheltered bay before dawn, leaving only smoking ruins and terrified survivors behind. Mainland armies might march slowly, burdened by heavy steel and cumbersome logistics, but here, speed, surprise, and absolute ruthlessness were the only currencies. The ability to traverse the treacherous, tide-churning channels of the Minch blind, guided only by the roar of the surf and generations of inherited instinct, was the mark of true power. Loyalty was measured not by oaths signed on parchment, but by how quickly a man could leap from his fishing boat to his war footing, shield in hand, broadsword singing a bloody, ancient song of vengeance. This was a culture forged in perpetual emergency. But the great chiefs had a far more insidious enemy than the king's slow-moving tax collectors or rival clans' raiding parties: the whispered word, the poisoned loyalty, the slow rot of internal betrayal. James IV, a master political manipulator centuries ahead of his time, understood that you didn't need to conquer the islands if you could convince the tenants of the islands to conquer themselves. Gold, heavy, bright English gold, often stamped with the foreign face of Henry VII, was shipped secretly into the Black Ports, not to pay for royal armies, but to pay for treachery. The goal was to fracture the deep-seated familial bonds that held the clan structure together. Who was the chief's cousin sleeping with? Whose second son was questioning the inheritance line? Every single decision made in the firelit interior of a great stone keep was now viewed through a lens of lethal, suffocating paranoia. Trust became the most dangerous luxury available. Look upon the ruined magnificence of Duart Castle, or the shattered walls of Armadale, and you see not just stone, but defiance etched into the rock face. These weren't opulent palaces designed for comfort. They were pure survival mechanisms, designed by grim necessity.
The walls were often 10 feet thick, constructed not just to repel a rival clan's axes and crude cannon fire, but crucially to withstand the literal, geological hammer blows of the Atlantic wind, which often reached hurricane force for weeks on end, threatening to dismantle the very foundations of civilization.
Inside these monolithic structures, the air was thick with peat smoke, the smell of damp wool, and the fear of the external world. Windows were not sources of light, but narrow, carefully angled slits designed solely for arrow fire, making the world outside a constant, terrifying enemy, whether it held a white squall storm or a rival galley full of screaming warriors.
How did a chief maintain this brutal, centralized power when his lands were scattered across 100 miles of violent, unpredictable water? Through the ancient, ironclad, and utterly ruthless practice of fosterage.
A chief would send his own heir, his eldest son, to be raised from infancy by a loyal tacksman, a lesser lord, on a distant isle. This wasn't delegation, it was an intentional creation of a blood bond deeper and more profound than mere legal paperwork or parental affection. The fostered son, raised alongside his foster brother, guaranteed mutual support between the major and minor branches of the clan for decades to come, creating an intricate, unbreakable web of political obligation that stretched across the Inner Hebrides. This network was enforced by the simple, brutal expectation of instant, total, bloody revenge for any perceived slight or broken vow. The chief himself, cloaked in saffron and dyed tartan, stood as the ultimate physical symbol of this defiant, brutal culture. He was a creature of paradox, a scholar of ancient Gaelic verse and mythological history one moment, a cleaver of heads and a commander of massacres the next. His hall might often be filled with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and acrid burnt peat. Yet he sat on a rough-hewn throne carved from ancient oak, holding a jewel-hilted dagger that glittered with the constant promise of swift, absolute, and personal power.
The psychological landscape of the islands was as volatile as the physical one. Every single shadow held a potential assassin sent by a rival. The psychological landscape of the islands was as volatile as the physical one. Every single shadow held a potential assassin sent by a rival Mac. Every strange sail on the horizon was a potential fleet of royal warships, or worse, a fleet of mercenary Irish gallo-glasses hired by a vengeful neighboring clan.
There was no room for neutrality, only varying degrees of impending, inevitable violence. The islanders lived by the adage that if you were not actively gaining ground, you were actively losing ground. And the price of losing was always the same: extermination. But this delicate, lethal equilibrium, held together by fosterage, fast Berlins, and institutionalized paranoia, could not possibly last forever. The king was patient. He waited, watching the chiefs bleed each other dry, knowing that eventually one clan would grow too powerful or too weak, and the moment for the final, surgical mainland strike would arrive.
And as the Atlantic roared, sounding less like wind tearing through the rigging and more like the hungry, anticipating breath of history itself, The great chiefs gathered their forces, knowing the game was nearing its terrible, unavoidable climax.
The next dawn would either bring salvation through overwhelming, total victory against their bitterest rival, or annihilation by the very forces of nature and politics they thought they had mastered through sheer force of will. This was the threshold. This was the point of no return for the sovereignty of the Isles, and the fire in the hearth was burning low.
The Atlantic wind did not just howl, it shrieked the death song of an empire. The mighty lordship of the Isles, once a rival to the very Scottish crown, was dissolving not in a glorious, decisive battle fought on bloody moorland, but in a slow, agonizing winter of political maneuvering, failed harvests, and the subtle, corrosive acid of fear. The fierce oaths sworn in the damped, smoky halls of the last MacDonald chiefs were now being tested not by the claymore of an invading army, but by the biting, insidious reality of famine and ambition.
King James IV, the cunning spider of the South, understood that the most effective way to dismantle a mountain was not to strike it head-on with siege engines and cannons, which would only unify the stubborn islanders, but to chip away at its base, targeting the fault lines already present within the granite heart of the Gaelic world. He knew that the price of ancient loyalty dropped dramatically when the stores ran empty, when the peat smoke offered no relief from the biting cold, and when the children cried with hunger in the desolate firelit interiors of their black houses. The weapon he deployed was not steel, but ink and parchment. He began dangling titles, charters, and, most importantly, security of land tenure directly in front of the individual clan chiefs, bypassing the traditional structure of the lordship completely. These offers were poison wrapped in gold leaf. Accept the king's authority, renounce the old Gaelic structure, and your lands would be confirmed forever under royal writ. Refuse, and the crown would empower your nearest rival, usually a cousin with a score to settle, or worse, the relentlessly ascending, land-hungry behemoth known simply as Clan Campbell. This political strategy, known as divide and rule, was a masterwork of slow-motion destruction, turning generations of strategic alliances into brittle, distrustful rivalries overnight. The MacLeods of Skye, the MacLans of Ardnummerchin, the MacNeils of Barra, every chief now faced the same terrifying dilemma, a choice between tradition and survival. To accept the king's charter was to preserve their lineage and their people, but it meant sacrificing the ancient, savage independence that defined them. It meant bowing the knee to a crown that saw their culture, their language, and their laws, the very foundations of their identity, as nothing more than savage relics to be swept aside in the name of civilization and centralized power. The winter of 1503-1504 became legendary across the Hebrides, not just for the depth of the snow, but for the depth of the desperation. The sea was too treacherous for fishing, the cattle died in the frozen pastures, and the grain stores, already depleted by years of skirmishes and failed crops, were exhausted entirely by Yule. This climatic horror was the king's silent, unacknowledged ally. He didn't need to send troops. The weather was doing the culling for him. Stories began to emerge from the northern islands. Tales of chiefs who secretly sent envoys, wrapped in heavy cloaks and sworn to silence, to the mainland ports of Ayr and Dumbarton. They were seeking not aid, but negotiation. They were seeking the king's seal, the legal document that would legitimize their stolen lands and secure their future, even if it meant abandoning the wider Gaelic cause. The great tragedy of the Isles was that the men who were supposed to lead them into glorious independence were now forced to choose between leading their people to starvation under the banner of freedom, or leading them to subjugation under the banner of peace. The psychological pressure was unbearable, fueling paranoia within the clan meetings held deep within the freezing, isolated keeps.
Every whisper was scrutinized. Every absent chief was suspected of treachery. The powerful Macayen of Ardnamurchan, one of the last true defenders of the old MacDonald power structure, found himself increasingly isolated. His own counselors urged him to seek terms, to recognize the inevitable shift in the balance of power, arguing that a live vassal was better than a dead king.
But Macayen was a man forged in the unforgiving furnace of the old ways. He viewed the king's offers not as relief, but as the ultimate insult, a spiritual surrender that would damn his soul. He held fast, clinging to the belief that the Atlantic, the winds, and the rugged geography of the Isles would always defend them against the smooth, soft men of the lowlands. This defiance, while noble, was precisely the weakness James IV was counting on.
Because while Macatane resisted, others succumbed. In the shadows of the outer Hebrides, the MacNeils, ever pragmatic and ruthless, made their move. They quietly executed a pact with the crown, securing their lands and, crucially, gaining official royal sanction to seize specific territories belonging to a neighboring, staunchly anti-crown clan, a clan they had hated for 2 centuries. This was the signal. This was the first deep fissure in the rock of the old Gaelic world, publicly demonstrating that the king's favors were real, and that the penalty for resistance was annihilation via a legally sanctioned rival. The MacNeils' move was not just a political shift. It was a profound, irreversible cultural betrayal. And the news traveled through the storm-battered islands faster than any messenger could sail. The fire-lit interiors of the chieftains' halls suddenly felt less like secure sanctuaries and more like traps. The Campbells, waiting patiently on the mainland, their power swelling daily, now had a legal foothold to begin their ruthless absorption of the western coast. The line had been crossed. The first drop of blood had been spilled in the War of Charters, and the sovereignty of the Isles was now officially bleeding out onto the king's parchment. The storm outside was no longer just the wind. It sounded like the thunderous march of legal papers being stamped with the royal seal, confirming the execution of the Gaelic dream. The execution order had been signed, not with a clean blade, but with the scratching quill of a king who had never tasted the salt spray of the Minch, yet held the fate of every Gaelic soul in his perfumed hand. The realization hit the gathered chiefs of the western seaboard like a rogue wave smashing their longhouse doors open. They were no longer petty warlords squabbling over cattle raids and fishing rights. They were now rebels, traitors to the crown, hunted prey in their own ancestral stronghold. The royal edict was merciless. Total forfeiture of lands and titles for any who dared to pledge allegiance to the shattered remnants of the lordship of the Isles. This wasn't merely politics. This was annihilation, delivered via official parchment. King James IV, a man whose ambition was as vast as the Atlantic, understood that brute force alone could not conquer these wild, fragmented realms. He needed a weapon far more insidious, a poison delivered from within. He found it in the boundless ambition and crippling greed of the minor clan leaders. It gave the designated king's men, often minor, power-hungry clan leaders, eager to climb the bloody ladder, the absolute authority to burn, seize, and execute their neighbors without fear of reprisal from Edinburgh. The crown turned brother against brother, offering the ultimate, horrifying incentive. Destroy your rival, and we will grant you his forfeited lands. The ancient bonds of kinship instantly dissolved in a torrent of calculated cruelty. Imagine the scene. A respected tacksman, whose family had held the tenancy for 10 generations, suddenly declared an outlaw by his cousin, simply because that cousin had kissed the royal ring. That cousin was now legally permitted to put the entire household to the sword and claim the land as a reward for his loyalty. The Minch, that churning strait separating the outer Hebrides from the mainland, became a viper's nest of swift galleys, not sailing for trade, but loaded with armed men and fire barrels. Every dawn brought the terrifying possibility of a sudden, legally sanctioned coastal raid. The royal forces didn't need to conquer every island. They only needed to isolate the strongholds and choke the sea lanes. Kintyre, always the closest mainland foothold, was immediately fortified, transforming into the dagger aimed directly at the heart of Islay, the former seat of power. The king's ships, heavy and slow, were no match for the swift, shallow-drafted burlens of the gales in a storm, but they carried the crushing weight of legal authority, and that, tragically, was heavier than any wave. The economic war was as brutal as the tactical one. Food supplies, vital for survival through the relentless winter, were intercepted and destroyed. The ancient economy of the islands, based on cattle, herring, and mutual aid, began to hemorrhage under the sustained pressure. Starvation became the mainland's most effective ally. Yet, even as the walls closed in, the old blood refused to kneel. The remnants of the Clan Donald leadership, scattered and hunted, became ghost legends.
They were led by men whose names still echo like thunder in the glens, fierce, unyielding figures who embodied the last spark of true Highland defiance. They mastered the art of the Crais, the lightning raid, not just for plunder, but for pure psychological warfare, striking the garrisons of the newly appointed royal factors.
They struck at night, vanishing into the peat bogs and mountain mists before the king's garrison even knew they were under attack. Their tactics were desperate, but devastatingly effective. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as the last true custodians of a dying civilization, defending Gaelic law and custom against the foreign imposition of Scots feudalism and continental ideas of centralized rule. For them, the struggle was existential. It was the clash between the unbound freedom of the wild seas and the suffocating, calculated rigidity of the Edinburgh court. The storm outside was now the sound of history being torn apart, limb by agonizing limb.
Paranoia became the common currency. Every stranger was a potential spy, every neighboring clan council a potential betrayal. Trust was now a luxury few could afford, and suspicion was the only shield against the commission of fire and sword. The fires that burned in the hearths were meant for warmth, but they cast shadows that looked suspiciously like the gallows awaiting those who harbored loyalty to the forfeited lordship.
Desperate, the remaining rebel leaders looked across the treacherous North Channel, their messengers, ghosting through the violent, turbulent waters, sought one last improbable ally who might understand the language of blood feuds and defiance better than the mainland king.
They looked to the ancient enemy, the source of eternal chaos and occasional salvation, Ireland. Specifically, the powerful, volatile lords of Ulster, men who shared their language, their culture, and their pathological hatred of centralized monarchical power.
The stage was set for the ultimate gamble. The fate of the entire Hebrides now rested on a treacherous sea journey and the unreliable goodwill of a foreign warlord. If Ulster turned its back, the flame of the Gaelic dream would be extinguished by the Atlantic winds forever. The galleys that sliced through the murderous waters of the North Channel were not ships of state. They were Berlins, skeletal wooden war canoes, relying on sheer manpower and a prayer to the ancient gods of the tide. These vessels, though swift and honed by generations of maritime savagery, were utterly unforgiving in the violence of the strait, that swirling, monstrous corridor of water separating Scotland's isles from the emerald coast of Ulster. Every wave was a cold, liquid fist thrown by the Atlantic, threatening to shatter the fragile wooden hull and swallow the last desperate hope of the gale.
The chieftains, huddled under wet woolen cloaks, smelling of peat and desperation, watched their hardened warriors bail furiously, their faces slick with salt spray and terror, their muscles burning from the endless pull against the storm's fury. They were not just facing the weather. They were facing the spiritual reality of their abandonment. If they sank here, forgotten by the crown and the mainland church, their sacrifice would simply become another forgotten tragedy, whispered only by the gulls circling high above the churning foam.
They were risking everything, trusting that the ancient bonds of kinship, the shared Gaelic heritage forged across centuries of raiding and trade, still held sway over the ruthless pragmatism of politics. They gambled that the blood that had flowed between the islands and Ireland for millennia was thicker than the rising ambition of the Scottish crown and the pervasive threat of English influence creeping up the Irish coast. They needed shelter, they needed weapons, but most of all, they needed a champion willing to draw the ire of a king across the water. Finally, after 3 days that felt like 3 years of unrelenting maritime torment, the towering, dark cliffs of Tyrconnell, the ancestral domain of the formidable O'Donnell, loomed through the heavy, swirling coastal mist. This was not a soft landing in a friendly port. This was the court of another king, a different kind of Titan, who viewed the desperate islanders not as long-lost cousins, but as necessary, expendable pawns in his own grand, bloody, and existential game against the relentless advance of the English Pale and the burgeoning power of Dublin. They were led inland from the miserable, soaked coastline, the heavy mud of Ireland clinging to their thick, weather-beaten boots, dragging them away from the sea that was both their ultimate lifeline and their constant, inescapable jailer. The principal O'Donnell compound was immense, heavily fortified, not by the simple, high stone towers of the Isles, but by massive, engineered earthen banks and towering timber palisades, a profound and brutal statement of relentless, enduring power built upon generations of successful raiding and defiance. Inside the vast timber-framed hall, the air was heavy and thick with the smell of roasting meat, strong honey mead, and the barely concealed tension of men holding knives beneath their heavy cloaks, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. The Hebridean delegation, famed throughout the known world for their ferocious fighting spirit, were now petitioners, forced by necessity to bow their proud, battle-worn necks before a man who held their very future, their clan's continuation, and their lineage's survival entirely within his cold, calculating gaze. Lord O'Donnell, a man whose dark reputation for strategic brutality preceded his arrival in any hall, sat upon a simple yet massive, unadorned oak throne, radiating an aura of absolute command. His silence was heavier and more suffocating than any spoken threat could ever be. He intentionally let the Scottish envoys twist in the agony of uncertainty, letting the chill of their raw fear seep into the very marrow of their bones. Before he finally spoke, his voice surprisingly measured and soft, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of mountains. "You come here, clan sons," he began, his eyes sharp and merciless, sweeping over their desperate, sea-battered figures, fleeing the soft, landlocked men of the East, begging for immediate protection. But protection is not a gift handed out freely in this world. It is a commodity that must be bought with coin, or, better yet, with the currency of dependable, spilled blood. He paused again, letting the damning implication hang in the smoky air, thick and poisonous to their pride. The O'Donnell, being a pragmatic warlord, did not want gold.
The impoverished isles had little left to offer beyond their ruined lands and shattered strongholds. What he truly craved was the unparalleled military asset the islanders possessed, the gallowglass. These were the fierce, professional Scottish mercenaries, the heavily armored infantry whose two-handed axes had already carved up vast tracts of Irish territory for centuries, redefining the very nature of conflict on the island. The price demanded for sanctuary was astronomical, a demand designed to cripple them while simultaneously elevating his own stature, a perpetual covenant to send their finest fighting men, their legendary gallowglass brigades, to fight O'Donnell's relentless wars against the encroaching English forces and his myriad internal Irish rivals. Furthermore, they had to formally recognize him, and not the distant, weakening King of Scotland, as the ultimate guarantor and overseer of their sea lanes, effectively granting him de facto naval supremacy in the western maritime reaches. This was not a dignified alliance between equals. This was an annexation by painful proxy. It meant that every time a bloody blade was drawn in the endless, muddy, and brutal wars of Ireland, a Hebridean family would mourn a son, lost fighting for a foreign crown, far from the familiar scent of the salt spray and peat smoke of his ancestral home. The old chieftain, the voice of the desperate delegation and the holder of their fate, swallowed the bitter draught of humiliation, his face etched with defeat. Survival was the only currency that mattered in this desperate transaction. To refuse this covenant was to sail straight back into the waiting, unforgiving arms of the Scottish king's waiting executioners and the swift, ignoble death of treason. To agree was to sign away their autonomy forever, chaining their destiny to the turbulent, unpredictable, and blood-soaked fortunes of Ulster, an island riddled with unending conflict. With a heavy, despairing thud, the parchment was finally signed, sealed with wax and the crushing weight of inevitable, agonizing compromise. They had traded the certain, swift death of outright war for the slow, grinding, and perpetual death of relentless servitude. The O'Donnell finally smiled, a cold, calculating gesture that promised infinitely more future treachery than immediate relief. The Gaelic flame was not entirely extinguished, but it was now burning under a strange foreign roof, fueled only by the sacrificial blood of their strongest young men, entirely susceptible to the volatile whims of an Irish warlord whose loyalty was as fickle and unpredictable as the Atlantic wind that had carried them there.
They had secured sanctuary, yes, but they had also unleashed the legendary gallowglass into the unstable heart of Ireland on a scale never before witnessed, unknowingly accelerating centuries of irreversible political and military change. The stage was now irrevocably set for the ultimate mercenary age, where the fate of Scottish clans would be decided not on their own heather-covered hills, but in the marshy, disputed fields of foreign wars. And the mainland king of Scotland, he had just been handed a powerful, resource-rich new enemy, armed and financed by the very men he sought so ruthlessly to destroy. The war was no longer contained within the desolate islands. It had gone catastrophically global. The great tide of blood was rising. The global war was not fought with maps and diplomatic niceties. It arrived with the thunderous roar of continental cannons, weapons forged in the furnaces of Flanders, paid for by the king's own gold,
which had been rerouted through secretive channels in Leith and Amsterdam. This was the catastrophic collision of high finance and ancient hatred, played out on rocks blasted by the North Atlantic winds, demonstrating that a war could be financed by the very enemies it sought so ruthlessly to destroy. The clan chiefs, masters of the dirk and the claymore, were now confronted not by simple border skirmishes, but by the brutal, calculating efficiency of modern European siege warfare, a lethal lesson in why isolation was no longer immunity for the mighty Gale.
The Crown, seeing their slow, bureaucratic chokehold failing against the savage resilience of the islanders, finally unsheathed a specialized weapon, Captain Archibald Rattray, known among the few survivors of his past campaigns simply as the Hammer of the Highlands. Rattray was a man carved from granite and malice, immune to the romantic notions of chivalry that still foolishly haunted some lowland commanders, and he brought with him 200 hardened lowland mercenaries. These men felt no kinship with the Gael and feared nothing but the king's displeasure, and they carried something the Isles had never truly mastered, the terrifying, unreliable, but utterly decisive power of the arquebus and the deadly, portable culverin. Every volley was a shattering roar that tore through the tightly packed ranks of the clansmen, turning furious, personal combat into a distant, impersonal slaughter, robbing the Highlanders of the close quarters rage that was their ancient birthright.
Clan MacDonald, already reeling from the deep financial hemorrhaging and the crushing realization of treachery within their own ranks, traitors whose identities remained chillingly shrouded in the shadows of their own great halls, realized that brute strength and centuries of pride would only guarantee extinction against Rattray's disciplined terror. Their ancient, peat-smoked halls became centers of feverish, whispered strategy, illuminated only by flickering tallow lamps that threw gigantic, desperate shadows across the stone walls, reflecting the internal turmoil of men facing an enemy they could neither outfight nor outrun. They desperately needed gold, and they needed men, but most crucially, they needed the knowledge to counter the gunpowder revolution that was extinguishing their way of life with brutal finality, reducing their ancient dominance to scattered ash. The chief of the MacDonalds, a man whose heart was now a fortress of ice and fury, forged in the crucible of constant loss, made the choice that would forever be etched in the annals of Highland shame and absolute necessity. He would negotiate with the ancient, despised enemy, the long-exiled Clan MacDougall. The MacDougalls had been marginalized and hunted for generations, yet they had retained deep, deadly ties to continental arms dealers operating out of the bustling, morally ambiguous ports of the Hanseatic League and the northern French coast.
The price demanded by the bitter, vengeful MacDougalls was monstrous, calculated to inflict maximum political and social damage. Control over the rich, vital fishing grounds of the Inner Hebrides, and the hand of the chief's youngest daughter in marriage. A political sacrifice so agonizing it shredded the last vestiges of the chief's honor, securing a blood tie steeped in resentment. But the very moment the courier carrying the terms of this desperate MacDougall pact stepped onto the mainland shores near Oban, the information was already compromised, filtered through a complex and lethally efficient network of spies. This network was orchestrated not by the king himself, who was often distracted by border conflicts and continental affairs, but by a certain powerful lowland earl residing deceptively close to the seat of power in Edinburgh, a man whose ambition was as boundless as his cruelty. This earl, whose name dared not be spoken aloud, even in the darkest, most isolated taverns, was funneling intelligence and detailed maps of clan strongholds directly into the hands of Captain Rattray, ensuring that every MacDonald move was anticipated and every defense rendered useless before it was even erected, turning the war into a predictable, one-sided execution.
The Atlantic winds, usually seen as fierce allies that drove away the clumsy Sassenach ships, now screamed like mournful, prophesying banshees, carrying the scent of burning thatch and distant cannon smoke across the black moorland. A constant, chilling reminder that their sacred, isolated domain was being systematically dismantled, stone by stone, life by life. Sleep became a luxury reserved only for the dead or the terminally insane. Every shadow held a potential assassin. Every approaching ship carried the promise of fiery destruction. And every meal tasted faintly of the salt of tears and the bitter tang of imminent, absolute defeat.
Rattray's campaign was textbook, psychological terror. Isolate, starve, then execute the survivors, ensuring that hope was extinguished before resistance could even be contemplated. He didn't seek glorious, decisive battle. He targeted the infrastructure of basic survival. Grain stores were systematically torched. Fishing boats were methodically shattered on the treacherous rocks, and wells were fouled with the rotting carcasses of slaughtered cattle. He was waging a war not against fighting men, but against the very fragile ecosystem that sustained the clans, aiming to ensure that even if they miraculously survived his shot and shell, the coming, brutal Scottish winter would finish the job with icy, inescapable cruelty, leaving nothing behind but famine and silence.
Driven to the brink of utter ruin, facing mass starvation and the collapse of their social order, the remaining clan chiefs held one final, suicidal war council deep within a mist-shrouded, forgotten sea cave on the Isle of Skye, where the raw sea spray washed over their terrified faces. Their strategy was insane, their objective nearly impossible. Bypass Rattray's deployed land forces entirely and strike directly at the naval support fleet harbored secretly in the protected inlet near the Isle of Mull, aiming to destroy the supply chain that fed the deadly lowland muskets and provided the relentless powder. If they failed, the clans would be reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the history of Scottish conquest, their proud names erased from the mainland records. Under the cloak of a ferocious, blinding storm that even the hardened islanders feared as a judgment from God, 300 elite warriors, the last, fiercest remnants of their respective houses, the ghosts of the Gael, set sail in small, low-slung currachs, their paddles muffled in thick woolen wraps, their faces grim and resolute. Propelled by the desperate, chilling hope that the fury of the Atlantic might finally conceal them from the enemy's watchful, murderous gaze, the fate of the entire ancient civilization of the Isles hung precariously upon the success of this single, impossible night raid. A terrifying gamble against overwhelming odds, pitting ancient, desperate fury against modern steel and gunpowder. The great tide of blood was not just rising. It was about to break in a wave of unimaginable violence.